March 1945. Patton's Third Army was moving faster than almost any Allied formation in the war. German defensive lines that had held through the winter were collapsing under pressure that wasn't giving them time to reorganize. Entire formations were surrendering before they could establish new positions. The advance that had seemed impossibly fast in the summer of 1944 was happening again, armor pushing east through territory that German commanders were abandoning faster than they could hand it over to the next unit behind them. Patton believed speed was the only thing that mattered now. Every day the advance continued was another day Germany couldn't establish the defensive line that might slow it down. Every gap that opened in German resistance was an opportunity that existed for hours before it closed again. The war was ending, and the question was whether it ended in weeks or months, and Patton believed the difference between those two outcomes was whether Allied commanders were willing to keep moving when caution suggested stopping. He kept moving. In late March, intelligence reached Third Army headquarters about a prisoner of war camp near Hammelburg, Oflag XIII-B. The camp held hundreds of Allied officers, American and Serbian, who had been imprisoned for months or years. As German territory shrank and Allied advances continued, the status of those prisoners was becoming uncertain. German forces moving prisoners ahead of advancing Allied armies was documented. The final weeks of a collapsing regime carried risks for men held inside its prison infrastructure that earlier stages of the war hadn't produced in the same way. The military case for acting was real. Deep armored raids were characteristic of Patton's operational style, bold, fast, designed to exploit confusion before an enemy could organize around it. The prisoners at Hammelburg represented exactly the kind of objective that a rapidly moving force might reach before German commanders understood what was happening. Intelligence from liberated officers who had been inside German prison infrastructure for years had genuine value, demonstrating that American armor could operate 50 miles behind collapsing German lines had genuine operational significance in the final weeks of a campaign that was still producing casualties. Patton had done more dangerous things for less defensible reasons and been proven right. The intelligence also indicated that among the officers imprisoned at Hammelburg was Colonel John K. Waters, Patton's son-in-law, captured in Tunisia in 1943. That single fact would follow everything that came after it, not because it proved anything, because it made everything impossible to fully separate from the question of whether it had mattered to the man who gave the order. Patton presented the military case to the officers he summoned to discuss the raid, the prisoners at risk, the operational opportunity, the intelligence value, the demonstration of armored reach. He didn't present Waters as a reason. Whether Waters was a reason, whether the name on the intelligence report had made Hammelburg feel more urgent than the other camps, more worth the risk, more deserving of the resources, was a question that existed inside the decision in a place the orders didn't reach. Patton gave the order, and the military case he put on the table was genuine enough that the question of what else might have been behind it had no clean answer then. It still doesn't. The officers who received the mission understood its parameters immediately. Task Force Baum would consist of roughly 300 men, tanks, half-tracks, armored cars, support vehicles. Captain Abraham Baum would command it. The objective was Oflag XIII-B near Hammelburg, approximately 50 miles behind current German lines. The task force would move independently. No secure supply line behind it, no nearby infantry support, no artillery support beyond what it carried. Limited fuel calculated against the distance it needed to cover. almost no possibility of reinforcement if German forces organized a counterattack before it could withdraw. The officers listened. The operational concerns were genuine. A battalion-sized force conducting an independent deep penetration into territory that was collapsing but not empty violated principles that armored doctrine had established through years of operational experience. German units that were surrendering in front of Allied armor were not surrendering everywhere. Pockets of organized resistance still existed. Armored formations capable of counterattacking a small, unsupported column were still operating in areas the task force would need to pass through. The raid was risky in ways that the military objectives, however real, didn't fully resolve. Whether those concerns were raised directly in the room where the orders were given is not fully documented. What is documented is that Baum received his orders. Patton was George Patton, the commander whose army had crossed France in weeks, broken the siege of Bastogne, and was currently moving faster than any Allied formation in the war. His operational instincts had been proven correct often enough that questioning them required more than concern about doctrine. It required certainty that the mission was wrong. Nobody in that room had certainty. Baum received his orders, and Task Force Baum moved out before dawn. The column drove east into German territory that was collapsing without being empty. German soldiers were surrendering in front of the advance. German soldiers were also still fighting in positions the task force needed to pass through. Baum's force engaged German units along the route, taking casualties, destroying vehicles, pushing through resistance that slowed the column without stopping it. The surprise Patton's planning had counted on was holding in the early hours. The task force kept moving. Behind it, the fuel the vehicles were burning wasn't being replaced. And German commanders in the area were beginning to understand that an American armored column was moving through territory they controlled, not advancing with a front line, not supported by infantry, not connected to anything behind it. They started organizing a response. Task Force Baum reached Oflag XIII-B on March 27th. The approach had cost them. Vehicles destroyed along the route. Casualties from the engagements that had slowed but not stopped the column. Fuel that had been calculated against the distance and was now calculated against what remained after the fighting it hadn't fully accounted for. The task force was at the objective. It was also smaller and lower on fuel than it had been when it left. The camp gates opened. Hundreds of prisoners came out, American and Serbian officers who had been inside the wire for months or years, men who had been living on reduced rations in deteriorating conditions, who had lost significant physical capacity during captivity, who were not in the condition that a combat extraction required. They came out anyway, because the alternative was staying. Colonel Waters was found. He was wounded during the attempt to reach the task force, shot while approaching under what should have been a flag of truce, hit before he could complete the movement that would have brought him out with the column. He was alive, but he was not capable of moving under his own power. The problem that had existed from the moment Patton gave the order was now fully visible on the ground outside Hammelburg. Task Force Baum had enough vehicles to move the men it had brought. It did not have enough vehicles to move those men, plus hundreds of prisoners who had spent years in a camp and were now standing in open ground 50 miles behind German lines with no transportation, no food, and no clear understanding of what came next. Some prisoners began moving west on foot toward Allied lines. Most couldn't. Baum made decisions under conditions that the planning hadn't fully resolved. Which prisoners could move, which vehicles could carry them, how much fuel remained against how far the column needed to travel to reach safety. While those decisions were being made, German forces were closing. The counterattack that German commanders had been organizing since Task Force Baum crossed their lines, arrived around the camp, and along the withdrawal routes simultaneously. German armor that the raid's planning had assessed as unlikely to be available in sufficient strength was available. Organized, coordinated, moving against a column that had no support behind it and no fuel margin for the kind of movement that breaking contact required. Vehicles were destroyed. Communication deteriorated. Baum was wounded. Waters was wounded and couldn't be moved quickly. The prisoners who had walked out of the camp gates hours earlier were now in the open between an American column that was being destroyed and German forces that were reasserting control of the territory the raid had briefly passed through. By the time the engagement ended, nearly the entire task force had been destroyed or captured. Baum was captured. Most of the men who had driven 50 miles into German territory were either dead, wounded, or prisoners themselves. Waters was eventually recovered, not by the task force that had reached him, but by advancing Allied forces that reached Hammelburg weeks later when the front line finally moved through the area. The raid that had been ordered to rescue him had failed to bring him out. The son-in-law Patton had sent men to reach was recovered without them. Back at Third Army headquarters, Patton received the reports as they came in. He had ordered the mission. He had presented the military case. He had not mentioned Waters by name in the orders. And now 300 men who had driven into German territory on his authority were dead or captured or scattered across 50 miles of ground that German forces were moving back through. The question that had existed from the moment the intelligence report arrived at headquarters, the question nobody had asked directly in the room where the orders were given, was now attached to an operational failure that couldn't be explained away. Patton's explanation was immediate and consistent. The raid had legitimate military objectives, hundreds of Allied officers at risk as Germany collapsed, an opportunity to demonstrate operational reach, intelligence value from liberated prisoners, a commander's responsibility to act when action was possible rather than waiting for conditions that might never arrive. He maintained that position for the rest of his life. The problem wasn't that the explanation was false. The problem was that it existed alongside a fact that couldn't be separated from it. Every military objective Patton cited was real. The prisoners at Hammelburg were genuinely at risk. The demonstration of armored penetration capability was genuinely valuable. The intelligence from liberated officers was genuinely useful. To Patton's defenders, those objectives were sufficient explanation for everything that followed. To Patton's critics, they were insufficient explanation for one specific thing. Dozens of prisoner-of-war camps existed across collapsing German territory. None of them received a task force. None of them were selected for a deep penetration raid conducted by a battalion-sized force without infantry support or secure supply lines during the final weeks of the war. To those critics, Hammelburg's selection was impossible to separate from the fact that John Waters was imprisoned there. To Patton himself, the military justification was enough. The historical record cannot conclusively prove which mattered more. Eisenhower didn't pursue the matter formally. The war was ending. Patton's Third Army was still moving. The operational failure at Hammelburg was real, but contained 300 men lost in a campaign that was consuming and producing casualties at scales that made battalion-sized disasters difficult to isolate as singular events. Senior commanders viewed the raid as an unnecessary risk that had produced predictable results. They didn't view it as something that required formal accountability from a commander whose army was still advancing faster than anyone else's. Patton survived Hammelburg professionally. the same way he had survived the slapping incidents, because his battlefield results made the cost of removing him higher than the cost of absorbing what he had done. The debate that followed outlasted the war by decades. Officers who had been in the room when the orders were given were interviewed by historians trying to understand what Patton had been thinking. The interviews produced consistent accounts of the military reasoning Patton had presented. They produced no definitive answer about what else might have been behind it. What historians eventually concluded was not a verdict, but a question that couldn't be closed. Patton probably believed the military objectives were real, because they were real, and because believing in bold action was fundamental to how he had commanded for 2 years. Whether Waters' presence at Hammelburg made the camp feel more urgent than the others, more worth the risk, more deserving of the resources that a task force required, was a distinction that lived inside Patton's thinking, in a place that after-action reports and official explanations couldn't reach. He didn't say. The men who might have asked didn't ask, and the raid that resulted destroyed the task force sent to conduct it while leaving the question that generated it permanently unresolved. That is what the title promised, not a verdict, a question that America's most aggressive battlefield commander took with him and never answered. Did Patton risk everything to rescue one prisoner? The military record says he ordered a raid with legitimate objectives. The circumstantial record says John Waters was there, and no other camp received the same treatment. Neither record can reach the place where the actual decision was made, which is why historians are still asking the question 80 years later, and why the men Patton sent into German territory to answer it never came back to tell us what they thought. The one man he had most wanted to reach came home weeks later. Without them,